The knock on the door. The town of Winterfield was buried in a deep, glittering frost that Christmas Eve. Icicles hung like jagged teeth from every gutter, and a soft blanket of snow turned even the plainest streets into something out of a postcard. Agnes Miller, a widow in her late 60s, stared out at the quiet street from the bay window of her modest home. The house was warm, filled with the soft glow of Christmas lights and the faint hum of a holiday radio station playing in the background. She sighed as she adjusted the small angel on the top of her artificial tree. It had belonged to her late husband, Martin, and she couldn't bear to replace it despite its fading golden wings. The silence in the house pressed against her ears. Agnes had always been a Christmas enthusiast, the kind of woman who spent weeks baking, decorating, and filling her house with the smells of cinnamon, cloves, and sugar. But this year, things were different. Her children, spread out across the country with their families, had decided to spend Christmas on their own. Their calls were brief and cheerful, full of apologies that rang hollow to her ears. Her grandchildren's absence was what stung the most. She pictured them ripping open their gifts in front of some sparkling tree hundreds of miles away, never even glancing at the sweaters she had knit or the books she'd mailed with painstaking care. For the first time in decades, her house felt more like a museum than a home, a place filled with memories but void of life. As the clock struck 7:00 p.m., Agnes poured herself a cup of tea and tried to focus on the old Christmas movie playing on TV. Snow fell steadily outside, and the wind howled softly, making the house creak and groan. She almost didn't hear the knock at first. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind. She paused, setting her teacup down and tilting her head toward the front door. Knock, knock. Her brows furrowed. She wasn't expecting anyone. Rising from her recliner, she shuffled toward the door, her slippers brushing against the hardwood floor. Another knock sounded, this one louder and more insistent. Who on earth could it be at this hour? She muttered to herself. Agnes unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, cautious out of habit. The sight that met her eyes froze her in place. A girl, no older than 8 or 9, stood on her porch. She was dressed in a tattered red sweater that was much too big for her, the sleeves hanging over her small hands. Beneath it, she wore a thin cotton dress, stained and threadbare, and no coat. Her legs were bare, marked with faint purple splotches from the cold, and her feet were stuffed into mismatched sneakers with holes in the toes. But what struck Agnes most was the girl's face. Her skin was pale, almost gray in the dim porch light, and her eyes were wide and glassy, as though she was looking at something far beyond Agnes. Her cheeks were streaked with grime, and her dark hair was tangled and matted. But it was the bulge of her belly beneath the oversized sweater that sent a chill through Agnes, colder than the December wind. "Sweetheart," Agnes said, her voice trembling slightly, "what are you doing out here? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer. She just stood there, shivering, clutching a small stuffed animal that had seen better days. It was a rabbit, with one ear missing and patches of its fur rubbed smooth. The girl's knuckles were white where they gripped it. Agnes's heart broke. Without waiting for a reply, she opened the door wider. "Come inside, dear, before you freeze to death." The girl hesitated, her wide eyes darting toward the street behind her, as though she was expecting someone, or something, to appear. Agnes followed her gaze but saw only the quiet street, the houses lit up with Christmas lights, and the snow falling softly in the glow of the street lamps. "It's all right," Agnes coaxed gently. "You're safe here. Come inside." Finally, the girl stepped over the threshold, her movements slow and cautious, like a wild animal unsure of whether it could trust a stranger. Agnes closed the door behind her, locking out the cold, and led the girl to the living room. "Sit here by the fire," Agnes said, pulling an old quilt from the back of the sofa and wrapping it around the girl's shoulders. "You must be freezing." The girl sat stiffly, clutching the quilt as though it might vanish if she let go. Her teeth chattered, and her cheeks were flushed a deep red from the cold. Agnes hurried to the kitchen, her mind racing. Who was this child? Where had she come from? Why was she out in the cold alone on Christmas Eve? She returned a few minutes later with a mug of hot cocoa and a plate of gingerbread cookies. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said, setting them on the coffee table. "Eat as much as you like." The girl stared at the plate for a long moment before reaching out with trembling hands. She took a cookie, biting into it tentatively. Then, as though some invisible barrier had broken, she began to eat ravenously, crumbs falling into her lap as she stuffed the cookies into her mouth. Agnes watched, her heart aching. She didn't press the girl with questions, sensing it would only frighten her further. As the girl ate, Agnes knelt beside her, carefully folding the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "What's your name, dear?" she asked softly. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door again. "Emma," she finally whispered, her voice so quiet Agnes had to lean in to hear it. "Emma," Agnes repeated, offering a reassuring smile. "That's a lovely name." "My name is Agnes." Emma didn't respond, but her posture seemed to relax slightly. Agnes decided to let the silence linger, hoping it might help Emma feel more at ease. She sat beside the girl on the sofa, watching as the firelight danced across the room. Outside, the wind howled, and the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, as Emma finished her cocoa, she turned to Agnes with a look of quiet desperation. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice trembling. Agnes's heart clenched. "Back where, sweetheart?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged the stuffed rabbit to her chest. "To Rick," she whispered. "He's mean." Agnes reached out, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "You're safe here," she said firmly. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Emma nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. For the first time, she leaned into Agnes, resting her head against the older woman's shoulder. Agnes held her close, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. Who was Rick? How had Emma ended up in such a terrible situation? And most importantly, how could Agnes protect her? As the fire crackled and the snow fell outside, Agnes made a silent promise. Whatever it took, she would ensure that Emma never had to face such fear and loneliness again. The plea for help. Agnes woke the next morning to the faint sound of rustling in the kitchen. For a brief moment, she thought it might have been her imagination. After all, she was used to the quiet of living alone. But then she heard it again, a soft clatter followed by the distinct creak of a cupboard door opening. Quickly pulling on her robe, she hurried down the hall, her slippers whispering against the floor. In the kitchen, she found Emma standing on a chair, rummaging through the upper cupboards. Her small hand shook as she tried to reach a loaf of bread tucked away on the top shelf. A pang of sorrow hit Agnes squarely in the chest. The child wasn't just hungry, she was desperate. "Oh, Emma," Agnes said softly, not wanting to startle her. "You don't have to do that, sweetheart. Let me help you." Emma froze, her small frame rigid with fear, as if she'd been caught doing something terribly wrong. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to wake you. I was hungry." Agnes moved slowly toward her, reaching out a hand. "It's okay, dear. You can have anything you want. But you don't need to climb on chairs. You might hurt yourself. Let me make you something, all right?" Emma hesitated for a moment before nodding. Agnes gently guided her down from the chair and sat her at the small kitchen table. She made a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, adding a few slices of fruit for good measure. As she set the plate in front of Emma, the girl's eyes lit up with gratitude. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice timid but sincere. She began to eat, not as ravenously as the night before, but still with an urgency that suggested she wasn't used to regular meals. Agnes sat across from her, watching quietly for a moment before speaking. "Emma, sweetheart, can you tell me a little more about yourself? Where you're from? How you ended up here?" Emma's grip on her fork tightened, and her gaze dropped to the plate. For a moment, Agnes thought she might refuse to answer. But then the girl spoke, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "I live with Rick," she said. "He's not my dad, but he takes care of me since my mom's gone." Agnes leaned forward, her heart aching at the sadness in Emma's tone. "Where's your mom, dear?" Emma paused, her lips trembling. She died," she said finally. "A long time ago. Rick said she was sick, and now he's the only one I have." Agnes's chest tightened. She reached out and gently placed her hand over Emma's. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. That must have been very hard for you." Emma nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Rick said I should be grateful he took me in, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head, her shoulders hunching as if she were trying to make herself smaller. "But what?" Agnes prompted gently. Emma looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "He's not nice," she whispered. "He yells a lot. And sometimes he hits me. If I don't do what he says, he gets really mad." Agnes felt a surge of anger rise within her, a rare and unfamiliar feeling. She forced herself to stay calm, not wanting to frighten Emma. "That's not okay," she said firmly. "No one should treat you like that, Emma. You deserve to feel safe and loved." Emma blinked back tears, her small hands clutching the edge of the table. "I ran away last night because he got mad. He said I didn't bring in enough money, but I tried. I did everything he told me to, but it wasn't enough." Agnes's stomach turned. "What do you mean, bring in money, Emma? What does Rick make you do?" Emma hesitated, clearly reluctant to answer. Finally, she muttered, "He makes me go to the mall and ask people for money. He says it's for food and rent. But I don't think it is. He spends it on beer and cigarettes." Agnes sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. This wasn't just neglect, it was exploitation. Rick wasn't taking care of Emma, he was using her. Taking a deep breath, Agnes forced herself to focus. "Emma," she said gently, "you don't have to go back to Rick. There are people who can help you, people who can make sure you're safe." Emma's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "No, I can't," she cried. "If he finds out I talked to someone, he'll be so mad. He'll find me. And—" Agnes reached across the table, taking Emma's trembling hands in her own. "Listen to me, Emma. I won't let anything happen to you. You're safe here, but we can't let Rick keep treating you this way. It's not right." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He'll find me," she whispered. "He always finds me." Agnes's heart ached at the sheer terror in the girl's voice. She knew she had to tread carefully. "All right," she said softly. "You don't have to decide anything right now. But I promise, I'll do everything I can to help you." Emma nodded reluctantly, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Agnes stood and began to tidy up the kitchen, her mind racing. She needed advice, someone who could guide her on how to handle this situation without putting Emma in more danger. She thought of her friend Martha, a retired social worker who had spent decades working with at-risk children. If anyone would know what to do, it was her. Later that morning, Agnes called Martha, explaining the situation as best she could without alarming Emma, who was curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book. "This is serious, Agnes," Martha said, her voice grave. "If what you're saying is true, this child is in immediate danger. You need to call CPS." "I know," Agnes replied, glancing toward the living room to make sure Emma couldn't hear. "But I'm worried about what will happen if they try to take her back to him. She's terrified of him, Martha, and I can't just sit by and let that happen." Martha sighed. "I understand, but the system is there for a reason. If you're not comfortable calling CPS yet, maybe we can start by getting more information. Bring her to me. I can talk to her, see if we can figure out the best way to help." Agnes hesitated. She didn't want to betray Emma's fragile trust, but she knew Martha was right. They needed to act quickly. "All right," she said finally. "I'll bring her over this afternoon." When Agnes hung up, she returned to the living room, sitting down beside Emma. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "I have a friend who helps kids who've been in tough situations. She's very kind, and I think she might be able to help us figure out what to do. Would you like to meet her?" Emma looked up, her eyes wary. "Will she make me go back to Rick?" "No," Agnes assured her. "She just wants to help you. That's all." After a long pause, Emma nodded. "Okay," she said softly. Agnes smiled, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from Emma's face. "Good. You're very brave, Emma. I'm proud of you." As Agnes began to prepare for their trip to Martha's house, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long, difficult journey. But one thing was certain. She wouldn't let Emma face it alone. A dangerous visit. The drive to Martha's house was quiet. Agnes glanced at Emma in the passenger seat, wrapped in one of her old woolen coats, far too big for the girl's small frame, but the warmest she had. Emma stared out the window, her fingers clutching the stuffed rabbit tightly. The streets of Winterfield were coated in fresh snow, and the sky was a dull gray, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Agnes's thoughts raced as she gripped the steering wheel. She had always lived a simple life, never venturing far beyond her small suburban world. Yet here she was on Christmas Day, driving with a neglected child in her car, and a determination to fight a battle she hadn't seen coming. For the first time in years, she felt alive, not just going through the motions but truly alive. When they arrived at Martha's modest home, Emma hesitated on the doorstep, her wide eyes scanning the street, as if expecting Rick to appear out of nowhere. Agnes placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, dear. Martha's a friend. You'll like her." Martha opened the door, her kind face creased with concern. She was in her 70s, her gray hair pulled back into a bun, and she wore an apron dusted with flour. "Agnes," she said warmly, pulling her old friend into a hug. Then she turned to Emma, her expression softening. "And you must be Emma. Come on in, sweetheart. You're safe here." Emma stepped inside cautiously, her small frame tense, as she took in the cozy living room filled with books, quilts, and the smell of freshly baked bread. Martha led her to the couch and offered her a plate of cookies. "Take your time, honey," she said. "You don't have to talk about anything until you're ready." As Emma nibbled on a cookie, Martha motioned for Agnes to follow her into the kitchen. Once they were out of earshot, Martha's face grew serious. "Agnes, this is worse than I thought. That poor child looks like she's been through hell." "She has," Agnes replied, her voice heavy with emotion. "She told me Rick uses her to beg for money. He drinks and yells at her. And worse. I can't let her go back to him, Martha." Martha nodded. "You're right. But if we want to help her, we have to do this carefully. The last thing we want is for him to retaliate." "What do we do?" Agnes asked, her hands trembling slightly. "I'll call a friend at Child Protective Services," Martha said. "She's discreet and experienced with cases like this. In the meantime, we need to make sure Emma feels safe enough to open up. The more details she can share, the stronger the case will be against Rick." Agnes nodded, her resolve strengthening. Whatever it takes. As the afternoon stretched on, Martha gently coaxed Emma into talking about her life with Rick. At first, the girl was hesitant, her answers short and guarded. But as the warmth of Martha's kindness and Agnes's presence surrounded her, Emma began to share more. "Rick doesn't like it when I talk to people," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says they'll take me away, and then I'll be alone forever. But I don't want to stay with him. He gets mad a lot. And when he drinks," her voice faltered, and she looked down, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Martha placed a comforting hand on her knee. "You're very brave for telling us this, Emma. You're not alone anymore. We're going to make sure you're safe." Emma nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. But what if he finds me? He always finds me. Agnes exchanged a look with Martha, her heart aching for the child. He won't, Agnes said firmly. Not this time. Martha excused herself to make the call to CPS, leaving Agnes and Emma alone in the living room. Agnes reached out and took Emma's hand. I know this is scary, sweetheart, but you're doing the right thing. You're so strong. Emma didn't respond, but she leaned into Agnes, resting her head on the older woman's shoulder. Agnes held her close, her heart breaking for all the fear and pain this little girl had endured. Later that evening, after leaving Emma safely in Martha's care, Agnes made a decision. She couldn't rest until she saw for herself the place where Emma had been living. With a mixture of trepidation and determination, Agnes drove to the address Emma had described, a rundown house on the outskirts of town. It was a stark contrast to the festive glow of Winterfield's neighborhoods. The windows were grimy, the front yard littered with beer cans and cigarette butts. Agnes parked a safe distance away and sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she studied the house. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the flicker of a television screen inside. A man's shadow moved across the window, large and looming. She didn't know what she had expected to find, but the sight of the house confirmed her worst fears. Emma hadn't exaggerated. This was no place for a child. Her heart pounded as she debated what to do next. Should she confront Rick? Call the police? Before she could decide, the front door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face unshaven, and he held a beer in one hand. He muttered to himself as he paced, taking swigs from the bottle and glancing around the yard. Agnes's breath caught in her throat. This had to be Rick. As she watched, Rick pulled out his phone and began yelling into it, his voice carrying across the empty street. I don't care what it takes. Get me that money. I'm not gonna lose my place over some brat who can't do her job right. Agnes's blood boiled. How could anyone speak about a child like that? Her protective instincts flared. And for a moment, she considered marching up to the porch and giving Rick a piece of her mind, but she knew it would be reckless. Instead, she stayed in her car, memorizing every detail. The license plate of the beat-up truck in the driveway, the peeling paint on the house, and Rick's voice. She would use this information to help CPS build a case against him. When Rick finally went back inside, slamming the door behind him, Agnes let out a shaky breath. She started her car and drove away, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. She felt both furious and determined. Furious that Emma had been forced to endure such a life, and determined to ensure she never had to return to it. Back at home, Agnes called Martha to update her on what she had seen. He's dangerous, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. We have to act fast. Martha reassured her that CPS was already working on it. You did the right thing, Agnes, she said. Just hold on a little longer. Emma's going to be safe. As Agnes hung up the phone, she felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, it seemed like there might be a way out for Emma, a chance for her to have the childhood she deserved. That night, as snow fell softly outside her window, Agnes sat by the fire, her thoughts consumed by Emma's brave little face. She didn't know what the future held, but she made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would protect Emma from Rick and give her a chance at a better life. Christmas confrontation. The sun was just beginning to rise over Winterfield when Agnes woke up. Sleep had been elusive, her mind churning with plans, fears, and the image of Emma's wide, fearful eyes. The house was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the living room. For the first time in years, Agnes wasn't thinking about how lonely Christmas felt. Her thoughts were entirely consumed by Emma, and the growing sense that time was running out. Agnes poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered street. She wondered if Rick had realized yet that Emma was missing. If he had, how long would it take him to find out where she had gone? Her gut told her that a man like Rick wouldn't let Emma slip away quietly. As if summoned by her thoughts, a battered pickup truck turned onto the street, its engine grumbling loudly in the still morning air. Agnes froze as the truck came to a stop in front of her house. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Rick. He was even more imposing up close, his broad shoulders hunched and his face set in a scowl. He stomped through the snow toward Agnes's front porch, his heavy boots crunching loudly. Agnes's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her, not in her own home. A loud pounding on the door broke the stillness. "I know you're in there, old lady." Rick's voice was rough and angry, slurred slightly, as though he had already been drinking. "You think you can take what's mine and get away with it." Agnes set her coffee down and walked to the door, her hands trembling slightly. She paused, taking a deep breath before opening it just a crack. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Rick's eyes narrowed, and he jabbed a finger at her. "Don't play dumb with me. I know you've got Emma. Where is she?" Agnes met his gaze evenly. "I don't know what you're talking about. If you're looking for a child, maybe you should consider why she might have run away." Rick stepped closer, his face inches from the door. The smell of alcohol and cigarettes wafted off him. "You listen here, lady. That girl is mine. She belongs to me. And you've got no right to take her. You think you're some kind of hero. You're not. You're just sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Agnes's grip tightened on the doorknob. "Emma is a human being, not your property. And if she's run away from you, it's because she's scared. What kind of man frightens a child like that?" Rick's face twisted in anger, and he slammed a fist against the doorframe, making Agnes flinch. "You don't know anything about me or her. You think you're better than me. You don't know what it takes to survive in this world. Now tell me where she is, or I'll—" "You'll what?" A new voice interrupted. Agnes turned to see Martha stepping onto the porch, flanked by 2 police officers. The officers' presence was a comforting sight, their calm, authoritative demeanor a stark contrast to Rick's volatility. Rick spun around, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What's this? You calling the cops on me, old lady? For what?" "I'm here for my kid." One of the officers stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Sir, we've received reports about your treatment of Emma. We need to ask you a few questions." Rick's bravado faltered, his eyes darting between the officers and Agnes. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I didn't do anything wrong. She's my responsibility, and I have every right to come get her." "Not if you're endangering her," the officer replied firmly. "We have reason to believe Emma has been neglected and mistreated. We'll need to conduct an investigation. In the meantime, she's in protective custody." Rick's face turned red with fury. "Protective custody? What does that even mean? You're taking her away because of what? Some sob story she told this woman. She's lying. Kids lie all the time." Agnes stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "Emma didn't lie about the bruises on her arms or the fact that she hasn't had a proper meal in days. She didn't lie about being forced to beg for money or being yelled at when she couldn't bring enough home. You did this to her, Rick. You failed her." Rick lunged toward her, but the officers quickly restrained him, pulling him back. "That's enough," one of them said firmly. "Sir, you're under arrest for child endangerment and neglect." Rick struggled against their hold, shouting obscenities as they led him toward the patrol car. "You think you've won," he yelled over his shoulder at Agnes. "You're just making it worse for her. She needs me." As the officers loaded Rick into the car, the street fell silent again. Agnes turned to Martha, who placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing," Martha said. "Emma's safe now." Agnes nodded, though her hands were still trembling. She looked back at the house, where Emma was watching from the window, her small face pale and frightened. Agnes waved to her, offering a reassuring smile. Back inside, Agnes found Emma curled up on the couch, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's over, sweetheart," Agnes said softly. "Rick can't hurt you anymore." Emma looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. "What's going to happen to me now?" she whispered. Agnes's heart ached at the fear in the girl's voice. "You'll stay here with me for now," she said, "and Martha and I will make sure you're placed somewhere safe, somewhere you'll be loved and cared for." Emma hesitated, then buried her face in Agnes's shoulder, sobbing quietly. Agnes held her close, stroking her hair and whispering soothing words. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace. Emma was safe, and they had taken the first step toward giving her a better life. As the snow continued to fall outside, Agnes thought about how her Christmas had turned out so differently than she had expected. It wasn't filled with the laughter of her grandchildren or the company of her children, but it was filled with something far more meaningful: the chance to give a little girl hope, safety, and a chance at a brighter future. Justice for Emma. The morning after Rick's arrest, the snow in Winterfield glistened under the pale sunlight. For once, the quiet felt peaceful rather than lonely. Inside Agnes's home, the air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine. Agnes sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, watching Emma, who was drawing with crayons she had found in a dusty box in the hall closet. Emma's small hand moved tentatively across the paper, sketching a rudimentary picture of a house. Agnes noticed how the house looked sturdy and welcoming, with bright windows and a cheerful garden. She knew the drawing represented a dream rather than a memory, and it made her heart ache. Agnes had spoken to Martha earlier that morning. CPS had started their investigation, and Rick was being held in custody while they collected evidence. Emma would remain with Agnes for the time being, under temporary protective care. It was a relief to know the girl wouldn't have to face Rick again anytime soon, but Agnes also felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She wanted more for Emma than safety. She wanted the little girl to experience true warmth, love, and stability, things she hadn't known for so long. "Emma," Agnes said gently, breaking the silence, "would you like to help me bake some cookies? It's something I used to do with my grandchildren, and I think you might enjoy it." Emma looked up from her drawing, her eyes lighting up. "I've never baked cookies before," she said softly. Agnes smiled. "Well, there's no better time to start." In the kitchen, Agnes guided Emma through the process of measuring flour, cracking eggs, and mixing sugar and butter. At first, Emma was hesitant, her hands clumsy as she held the measuring cups and spoons. But as Agnes patiently encouraged her, the girl began to relax, a shy smile spreading across her face. "You're doing wonderfully," Agnes said, watching as Emma carefully stirred the dough. "Baking is an art, you know. You have to put a little love into it." Emma giggled, a sound Agnes realized she hadn't heard before. It was light and musical, filling the room with a warmth that made Agnes's chest tighten. For a brief moment, she thought of her own children and grandchildren, and how distant they felt from her life now. But she quickly pushed the thought aside, focusing on the joy in front of her. As the cookies baked, Agnes and Emma sat on the kitchen floor, watching the oven through the glass door. The scent of vanilla and chocolate filled the air, mingling with the laughter they shared as Agnes recounted stories of baking disasters from her past. That afternoon, Martha arrived with 2 CPS caseworkers. Emma immediately tensed at the sight of the strangers, clutching Agnes's hand tightly. "It's okay, sweetheart," Agnes murmured, crouching down to meet Emma's gaze. "These people are here to help. You're not in trouble, I promise." The caseworkers, a man and a woman, introduced themselves as Mr. Patel and Ms. Green. They knelt to Emma's level, their expressions kind but serious. "Hi, Emma," Ms. Green said softly. "We just want to ask you a few questions so we can make sure you are safe. Is that all right?" Emma hesitated, glancing at Agnes for reassurance. Agnes gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "It's okay, dear. I'll be right here." Emma nodded reluctantly, and the caseworkers led her into the living room, where they began their interview. Martha stayed in the kitchen with Agnes, watching through the doorway. "She's a strong little girl," Martha said quietly. "You've done so much for her already, Agnes. You should be proud." Agnes sighed, her eyes fixed on Emma. "I just want her to have a chance at a better life. She deserves that." Martha nodded. "She does, and you're giving her the foundation for it." The interview lasted nearly an hour. When it was over, Emma returned to the kitchen, looking tired but calm. She climbed onto a chair beside Agnes and leaned against her, clearly seeking comfort. Agnes wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. Mr. Patel and Ms. Green re-entered the room, their expressions thoughtful. "Thank you for cooperating, Emma," Ms. Green said. "You were very brave." Emma didn't respond, but she clung tighter to Agnes's side. Mr. Patel turned to Agnes. "We've gathered enough information to move forward with the investigation. Rick's actions clearly constitute neglect and abuse, and he's already facing charges. But we'll need to make long-term arrangements for Emma's care." Agnes's heart sank. She had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "What kind of arrangements?" she asked. "We'll begin the process of finding a suitable foster family," Ms. Green said gently. "It's possible Emma could be placed with relatives, if any can be located." Agnes glanced down at Emma, whose face had gone pale. The girl's grip on her arm tightened. "What if I don't want to go to another family?" Emma whispered. "What if I want to stay here?" The room fell silent. Agnes felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked into Emma's pleading eyes. The thought of letting her go was almost unbearable. "Emma," Ms. Green said kindly, "we understand how you feel, but we need to make sure you're placed somewhere that's in your best interest." "What if her best interest is right here?" Agnes asked, her voice firmer than she'd expected. "What if I want to take care of her?" The caseworkers exchanged a glance. "That's certainly an option," Mr. Patel said. "If you're serious about fostering or adopting Emma, we can begin the process. It's not a simple road, but it's possible." Agnes looked at Emma, her heart swelling with love and determination. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, home visits, and court hearings. Through it all, Agnes remained steadfast, determined to prove that she could give Emma the stability and love she needed. Emma, for her part, began to blossom under Agnes's care. Her laughter grew more frequent, her smiles brighter. The dark circles under her eyes faded, and she began to sleep through the night without waking in fear. Rick, meanwhile, was convicted of child endangerment and sentenced to prison. Emma never asked about him, and Agnes never brought him up. For both of them, he was a part of the past, a shadow that no longer loomed over their lives. On a crisp February morning, Agnes stood in a small courtroom, holding Emma's hand as a judge finalized the adoption. When the gavel struck, Agnes felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She looked down at Emma, who was beaming up at her with tears in her eyes. "You're really my family now?" Emma asked softly. Agnes knelt, pulling her into a hug. "We always were, sweetheart." That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Agnes looked at Emma, who was curled up beside her with the stuffed rabbit in her lap. For the first time in years, the house felt alive, filled with the kind of love and joy that couldn't be found in decorations or gifts. Emma looked up at Agnes, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think my mom would be happy for me?" Agnes smiled, stroking her hair. "I think she'd be very proud of you, Emma. You're brave, kind, and strong, and I know she'd be grateful that you're safe now." Emma leaned against her, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "I love you, Grandma Agnes." Tears filled Agnes's eyes as she kissed the top of Emma's head. "I love you too, sweetheart. Merry Christmas." For the first time, Agnes felt that her life was complete. Emma had given her the greatest gift she could have ever hoped for. a reason to believe in miracles again. The days following the adoption hearing were a mix of quiet moments and big adjustments. Agnes and Emma settled into a new rhythm of life together, one filled with small, meaningful rituals: cooking breakfast, working on homework at the dining table, and reading stories before bed. Emma's laughter began to fill the house in ways that even Agnes hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, the house felt like a home again. But the shadows of Emma's past lingered. A community rally. Word of Agnes's decision to adopt Emma spread quickly through the small town of Winterfield. The once quiet widow had become the center of attention in the community, though not all of it was positive. Some neighbors whispered about the trouble Agnes had brought into her home, speculating that Emma's presence would only cause problems. Others, however, admired her courage and rallied around her, offering support in the form of clothes, school supplies, and even toys for Emma. One Saturday morning, as Agnes and Emma walked hand in hand to the local market, they were stopped by Mrs. Carmichael, a longtime neighbor who had always seemed more interested in gossip than goodwill. "Agnes," Mrs. Carmichael said with a forced smile, her sharp eyes darting toward Emma. "I've been hearing a lot about what you're doing for this little one here. It's quite noble." Agnes felt Emma tense beside her, and she gave the girl's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Emma's a blessing," Agnes said firmly. "I'm the lucky one." Mrs. Carmichael's smile faltered, but before she could respond, another voice cut in. "Don't mind her, Agnes. It was Mr. Peterson, the jovial owner of the bakery. The whole town knows what a hero you are." Agnes smiled gratefully, feeling Emma relax at the kind words. Mr. Peterson knelt down to Emma's level and handed her a small bag of freshly baked cookies. "Merry belated Christmas, young lady," he said with a wink. Emma hesitated before accepting the bag, her face lighting up with a shy smile. "Thank you." Agnes watched the exchange, her heart swelling with gratitude. Though not everyone understood her decision, there were people who cared, and who were willing to stand by her and Emma. Unresolved fears. Despite the progress Emma was making, she still struggled with nightmares. Most nights, Agnes would wake to the sound of the girl crying out in her sleep, her small frame trembling as she clutched her stuffed rabbit. One night, Agnes decided to sit with her and talk. "Sweetheart," she said softly, brushing Emma's hair back as the girl's tears subsided, "do you want to tell me what your nightmares are about?" Emma hesitated, biting her lip. "It's Rick," she whispered finally. "I keep dreaming that he comes back and takes me away." Agnes's heart ached. "Rick can't hurt you anymore, Emma. He's in prison, and even if he weren't, I'd never let him near you." "But what if he gets out?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "What if he finds me?" Agnes thought for a moment, then reached for the small wooden box on her nightstand. Inside was a gold locket she had worn as a young woman, its surface etched with delicate swirls. She opened it, revealing a tiny photograph of her late husband on one side and a blank space on the other. "This," Agnes said, slipping the locket around Emma's neck, "is your reminder that you're safe. When you're scared, you can hold it and remember that you're loved and protected. Nothing bad will happen to you as long as I'm here." Emma held the locket tightly, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandma Agnes," she whispered. Agnes kissed her forehead. "Now try to sleep, sweetheart. You're safe." The courtroom showdown. Although Rick had been arrested, his sentencing hearing loomed, and Agnes was determined to attend. Emma was too young to face the courtroom, so Martha stayed with her while Agnes prepared for what she knew would be a difficult day. The courtroom was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the warm safety of home. Rick sat at the defendant's table, his once threatening demeanor diminished by his orange jumpsuit and shackled wrists. Yet his eyes still burned with defiance, scanning the room until they landed on Agnes. She refused to flinch under his gaze. The prosecutor presented a damning case, detailing years of neglect and abuse. Agnes listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as the evidence confirmed what she already knew. Rick had stolen Emma's childhood, using her as a tool for his own gain. When it was time for Agnes to testify, she stood with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "Emma is a remarkable child," she began, her voice steady. "Despite everything she's been through, she's kind, brave, and full of hope. No child deserves the pain she's endured, and I won't let her suffer anymore. She's safe now, and she will stay safe." Rick smirked, but Agnes ignored him, focusing instead on the judge. "I'm asking this court to ensure that he never has the chance to hurt her, or any child again." Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with emotion. When the verdict was finally read, Rick sentenced to 10 years in prison. Agnes felt a wave of relief. It wasn't just justice for Emma. It was a promise that the girl's nightmares would not become reality. A brighter tomorrow. That evening, Agnes returned home to find Emma waiting by the window. The girl ran to her as soon as she walked through the door, wrapping her arms around her waist. "What happened?" Emma asked, looking up at her with wide, anxious eyes. Agnes knelt to meet her gaze, a smile spreading across her face. "Rick won't hurt anyone anymore," she said. "You're safe, Emma. Really and truly safe." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged Agnes tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Agnes held her close, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift from her shoulders. They had fought a hard battle, but they had won, and Emma's future was finally her own. That night, as Emma slept peacefully in her room, Agnes sat by the fire, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Her life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined, but it felt fuller, richer, and more meaningful than ever. Emma wasn't just a child who needed saving. She was a gift, and Agnes was determined to treasure her for as long as she could. A new family. Winter slowly gave way to spring, the snow melting into small streams that trickled through the quiet streets of Winterfield. For the first time in years, Agnes felt the warmth of hope looming alongside the crocuses in her garden. She watched as Emma, now noticeably healthier and more confident, knelt by a patch of freshly planted flowers. The girl's laughter, light and musical, drifted toward Agnes as she leaned on the porch railing. Agnes had never imagined her life would take this turn. After years of quiet routines and solitary holidays, her days were now filled with vibrant energy. Emma had brought a spark into her life that no amount of holiday decorations or family phone calls had ever matched. But as much as Agnes cherished these moments, she knew there were still challenges ahead. The healing process. Emma's adjustment to her new life wasn't without its hurdles, though she was growing stronger every day. There were moments when her past weighed heavily on her. Agnes often found her staring out the window at night, clutching the gold locket around her neck. One evening, Agnes joined Emma by the window, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Emma hesitated before answering. "Sometimes I still feel scared," she admitted. "Like everything here is a dream, and I'm going to wake up back in that house with Rick yelling at me." Agnes knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "I understand," she said. "When you've been through something as hard as you have, it can feel like it never really leaves you. But you're safe now, Emma. This isn't a dream, it's your life. And no one can take it away from you." Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you think it'll ever stop? The nightmares?" "It will," Agnes said, pulling Emma into a hug. "It'll take time, but I promise, one day those fears will be just a memory. And until that day comes, I'll be right here with you." A visit to the past. Though Rick was gone, Emma's past still lingered in other ways. One afternoon, a social worker from CPS called Agnes to let her know that a distant aunt of Emma's had been located. The woman, named Clara, had been estranged from the family for years, but had recently learned about Emma's situation and wanted to meet her. Agnes was hesitant. Emma was just beginning to feel secure in her new life, and she didn't want anything to disrupt that. But when she explained the situation to Emma, the girl surprised her. "I want to meet her," Emma said firmly. "I want to know if she's really my family." The meeting was arranged at a nearby park. Agnes and Emma arrived early, sitting together on a bench beneath a blooming dogwood tree. Emma fidgeted with the locket around her neck, her expression a mix of curiosity and anxiety. When Clara arrived, Agnes was struck by how much the woman resembled Emma. She had the same dark hair and wide, curious eyes, though her face bore lines that spoke of a hard life. Clara approached cautiously, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You must be Emma." Emma nodded, standing and taking a step closer. "Are you really my aunt?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Clara smiled softly. "I am. Your mom was my younger sister. We lost touch a long time ago, and I didn't know about what happened to her until recently. I'm so sorry, Emma. If I'd known, I would have come for you sooner." Emma studied her aunt for a long moment before finally breaking into a tentative smile. "It's okay," she said. "You're here now." The three of them spent the afternoon talking, sharing stories about Emma's mother and the family Clara had left behind. By the time they parted ways, Emma seemed lighter, as though a missing piece of her past had finally been restored. A new beginning. Summer arrived, bringing with it long, sunny days and the smell of blooming flowers. Agnes and Emma settled into a happy routine, their bond growing stronger with each passing week. Agnes enrolled Emma in summer art classes, where the girl discovered a talent for painting. Her artwork began to fill the house, brightening the walls with vivid colors and imaginative scenes. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Emma handed Agnes a painting she had been working on in secret. It depicted a cozy house surrounded by flowers, with two figures standing in the front yard, a small girl with dark hair and an older woman with silver hair. "This is us," Emma said shyly, watching as Agnes studied the painting. "This is home." Agnes felt tears welling in her eyes. She pulled Emma into a hug, holding her tightly. "It's beautiful, Emma. Just like you." Christmas comes again. By the time Christmas rolled around again, Emma had become a permanent fixture in Agnes's life. The adoption process had been finalized, and the two of them had officially become a family. Agnes spared no effort in making the holiday special, decorating the house from top to bottom, and baking all of Emma's favorite treats. On Christmas morning, they sat together by the tree, unwrapping gifts and sipping hot cocoa. Among the presents was a brand new set of art supplies for Emma, along with a framed photo of the two of them, smiling together in front of the garden. "Do you like it?" Agnes asked as Emma examined the photo. Emma nodded, her eyes shining. "It's perfect," she said. "This is the best Christmas ever." Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, Emma turned to Agnes with a serious expression. "Do you think my mom would be proud of me?" she asked. Agnes smiled, brushing a lock of hair from Emma's face. "Oh, sweetheart, she'd be so proud. She'd be proud of how brave you are, how kind you are, and how strong you've become." Emma rested her head on Agnes's shoulder, her voice soft. "I'm glad I found you." Agnes kissed the top of her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "And I'm glad you found me. You've made my life brighter than I ever imagined it could be." As the fire crackled and the snow fell gently outside, Agnes and Emma sat together, wrapped in the warmth of love and belonging. The journey that had brought them together hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. They were no longer two strangers trying to survive. They were a family, bound by hope, resilience, and a shared determination to create a future filled with joy. This time, Agnes didn't feel alone. She felt whole, and as Emma drifted off to sleep in her arms, Agnes silently thanked the little knock on her door that had changed everything.